Hello and good evening, everyone. Before I continue with my talks on the future poetry, let me thank Overman Foundation once again for giving me the opportunity to deliver on Sri Aurobindo's The Future Poetry. And this book is all about poetry, and so along with Sri Aurobindo, let us discuss more about poetry here. In one chapter of the book, Sri Aurobindo writes about the style and substance of poetry, dwelling again on rhythm and telling us of the different types of imagination. Now, imagination it plays a good enough role in the art of poetry writing. So today, let us begin our discussion with a definition and explanation of rhythm in poetry. Now, talking of rhythm, Sri Aurobindo feels that rhythm and the use of rhythm and the necessity of rhythm was certainly better understood by the ancients, and comparatively very little is understood by the moderns, and in extreme cases, we may say it has been dispensed with almost altogether. And this is because of the fact that the ways and habits of the ancients differ in vital ways from the moderns as regards poetry, especially. And here Sri Aurobindo draws our attention to the important fact which we tend always to overlook, that today we read poetry always and hardly ever with intonations. The ancients, on the other hand, were in the habit of singing, chanting hymns, intoning their poems, and perhaps that is why they understood the value of rhythm. We read poems today, and but that's about doing very little justice to the efforts of the poet. In a similar manner, that we can hardly do justice to a drama because we read it out, but when it's supposed to be enacted for us, from the stage to the page and the page only, that's one of the worst things that can happen to dramatic art. In much the same way, poetry suffers without the proper use of poetic rhythm. And here I take this little liberty of adding my own observations that we hardly practice reading poetry even today, because it's something to be written about, analyzed, and commented upon. That is how we look at a poem basically. However, Sri Aurobindo tells us that reading a poem is not without its uses altogether. This kind of practice may help to bring the intellectual and also the emotional value of a poem, but depresses the rhythmic value. For instance, consider reading a poem. Okay, this is a sonnet I've chosen by Shakespeare, and I'm quoting a part of it, where the poet says, "So are you to my thoughts as food to life, or as sweet seasoned showers are to the ground. And for the peace of you I hold such strife as twixt a miser and his wealth is found." So when we read the lines, we feel along with the poet his love for his friend, and reading alone these lines awakens a sort of, the romantic in us, maybe. Okay, or take these lines from another supreme poet of love, Petrarch, whose words, even in translation, awaken this passion in us. "It is for you I burn, in you I breathe, for I am yours alone. Deprived of you, I suffer less for all my other pains." And after this, try listening to the chanting of a mantra. Now, many good audios are available today, technologically made available. And when this is done by an efficient person and expert, that is one who is learned in this art, the mantra actually empowers us. In fact, it is the chanting which enchants, the sound, the rhythmic sound which captivates. And I can especially vouch for Koric Vedic chants, the mantras. They get glued to your inner ear. The soul in you listens, so to speak. Now, Sri Aurobindo says that rhythm is a premier necessity of poetical expression. It is because the sound movement is important anywhere, and in poetic art, the thought movement rides upon the sound movement. The thoughts are carried home to us through the sound. Consider the musical sound image. Now, music is powerful, almost hypnotic in some cases. It is used as therapy, it gives pleasure, it calms and soothes. The power of the rhythmic sound endures. Now, poems written in free verse, the Via Liber, as we discussed in the last talk, is not perhaps as satisfying. Sri Aurobindo, but Sri Aurobindo has some regard for modern poetry. It is good when we consider the thought content of modern poems and their varied stylistic modes. Sometimes we also find great subtlety in theme, and there is also depth of suggestion and fineness of language, style, and diction also. So let us consider one or two examples. Um, I'll read a few lines from one of the great modern poets, T.S. Eliot, who writes in one of his beautiful poems, Marina. What seas, what shores, what grey rocks, and what islands, what water lapping the bow and scent of pine and the wood thrush singing through the fog. What images return, O my daughter? What is this face less clear and clearer, the pulse in the arm less strong and stronger, given or lent? More distant than stars and nearer than the eye, whispers and small laughter between leaves and hurrying feet, under sleep where all the waters meet. Now look at this rhythm. There's the rhythm of something deep, something profound, and this itself creates a unique rhyme of its own, though without proper rhyming words. We have beautiful poetry here, springing out of the cadence and the metrical arrangement and the thoughts it arouses in our minds. But all poets, of course, cannot reach the high style of poems like these with their profound themes. And all poems, therefore, cannot be called poetry as such. Sri Aurobindo says some poems cannot aspire to be poetry, they must forever dwell in the region of half poetry. See, satire, for instance. It is, according to Sri Aurobindo, half poetry only, because it is the critical mind mainly which creates it. Creative vision and poetical feeling hardly have their play here. Next, Sri Aurobindo makes an interesting point about poetry, allying it to painting, sculpture, or even architecture, which he feels these are all kindred arts. As we can see the beauty of a painting or a sculpture, we use our physical eyes, physical senses. Similarly, much of the appeal of poetry comes from the significant, powerful, and beautiful images drawn by the poet. It is thus that poetry appeals to the spirit of man. In his essays on Indian art, Sri Aurobindo has written that Indian art is basically spiritual and intuitive, and this is true of Indian culture as a whole. A seeing in the self. This is the characteristic method of the Indian artist. So, poetry, like the other arts, must reveal something veiled by the form of the words. It's similar to the method employed in the other arts. Now, in an essay, Sri Aurobindo wrote, architecture, sculpture, and painting, because they are the three great arts which appeal to the spirit through the eye, are those two in which the sensible and the invisible meet with the strongest emphasis on themselves, and yet the greatest necessity of each other. That is, what he's saying is the that is harmony of the soul and the sense has been the aim of Indian art at its highest and greatest. And as Sri Aurobindo said, the aim of the Indian artist is to disclose something of the self. In poetry, too, we have the mental and verbal image. And this helps us in comprehending the vision of the poet. Words create this image, and so the essential power of the poetic word, Sri Aurobindo tells us, is to make us see rather than to make us think or feel. So I'll quote a few lines from a poem by Sri Aurobindo himself, which I have always felt has powerful images. Here, see, in this part of the poem which I am quoting, he portrays Shiv, the inconscient creator, as he calls him. He portrays this Lord Shiv in these words: a face on the cold, dire mountain peaks, grand and still, its lines white and austere match with the unmeasured snowy streaks, cutting heaven implacable and sheer. Above it, a mountain of matted hair, aeon coiled on that deathless and lone head. So, see how powerful these words are, how these words and the language with its powerful rhythm actually draws for us the huge form of the God with all its details. And lines like these surely come from an inner vision. Thus, according to Sri Aurobindo, sight is very important in poetry. It is the primary consequence and power of poetic speech. That is, a poet is much more than a mere versifier. A poet is a seer and not merely a maker of rhymes or merely a thinker. A true poet must compel us to see, and when the poet can himself stretch his sight beyond the mere surface mind and find the revealing word, it is then that he fulfills his task as a poet. It is the illumined, illuminating, the inspired and inevitable word that makes us see, and all great poetry achieves this. Take this hymn from the Rigveda, where the Rishi says, from fervor kindled to its height, eternal law and truth were born. Thence was the night produced, and thence the billowy flood of sea arose. From that same billowy flood of sea the year was later produced, ordainer of the days and nights, Lord over all who close the eye. So this is a vision brought to us, portrayed in rhythmic word, rhythmic language. So, in this context, further, that is, in the context of poetry and rhythm and style and substance, Sri Aurobindo dwells a while on the role of the imagination in poetry. The poetic imagination he categorizes into different types. There is first the objective imagination, he calls it the objective imagination. And when this objective imagination has its play, the outward aspects of life are projected in poetry. For instance, these lines from one of Iskal's poems may be read here as an example. When he's writing, the city pressed upon me, shops, cinemas, and business houses spoke in unambiguous accents. Only the people said nothing. They bought the evening papers, hurried to a tube station, ceasing to exist. So, this is a picture of the reality that we get as the poet has seen it. Similarly, there is what Sri Aurobindo calls the subjective imagination, and it is that faculty which helps to visualize the mental and emotional impressions. And from Sri Aurobindo's own poems, we may get many examples. For instance, see these lines uh, in these, this power of the imagination, that is a subjective imagination of the poet, is at display. I am quoting part of the poem. I feel the wash and hear the sibilation of the waves that whisper to each other as they push to shoreward side by side, long lines and dim of movement flecked with quivering spots of foam. So many images, the imagery is wonderful over here. Then there is what is called poetic fancy. It is akin to imagination only, though it's termed differently. This is more to do with mental fictions. So look at this descriptive poem, a part of it. A lady walketh forth into the night when a hushed fragrance lies upon the street, and the walls are quiet and shadowy, and the lake a gleaming sheet. So these are the different categories of the imagination that Sri Aurobindo talks about. Now, there's another category, the aesthetic imagination. And this is another category, and Sri Aurobindo says that through the use of this, the poet displays the beauty of words and images. That is, the inherent beauty of words are delightful. Words and images delight for their own sake. But all these, Sri Aurobindo says, these are all only the first instruments and some basic materials for the poet to build up his style. These are not the essential poetic imagination. The essential poetic imagination is higher than all these which we have just named and we were discussing. Okay? That is objective imagination, subjective imagination, even aesthetic imagination, the poetic fancy. Above all these is the essential poetic imagination. It is now this essential poetic imagination is a creative power. It is of the more, or in fact, it's of the most real. The essential poetic imagination is concerned with the spiritual truth. It sees the spiritual truth of things, while the other faculties of the mind, the fancy or the aesthetic imagination, or others, may be satisfied with a mere representation or reproduction of things, or even decorating and coloring of the image. The essential poetic imagination penetrates into the heart of truth, reveals the spiritual truth to us. So we may not be wrong if we say the essential poetic imagination is a power and a faculty higher and greater than fancy and imagination when these are taken in the common sense. And this power has to work if the real aim of poetry is to be fulfilled. And the aim of poetry, according to Sri Aurobindo, is, and I'm quoting, he says, it's neither a photographic or otherwise realistic imitation of nature, nor a romantic furbishing and painting, or idealistic improvement of her image, but an interpretation by the images she herself affords us, not on one but on many planes of her creation, of that which she conceals from us, but is ready, when rightly approached, to reveal. Unquote. So, the aim of poetry is to reveal the reality concealed by nature, hidden by nature. Now, presenting or reproducing what is already visible is not the high aim of poetry. It cannot be, because even a simple photograph can represent reality, so to speak. It's not imitation that we need, nor even the high coloring of the imagination, and neither a distorted or an idealistic picture. What we aim in poetry is the revelation of the truth. Our ancient rishis were of the most successful of poets in this regard. Sri Aurobindo himself, in many of his poems, especially in Savitri, has achieved this. So I'm just quoting from one of his poems, which has a mantric touch to the lines, where he's writing, not sound nor silence, neither world nor void, but the unthinkable, absolute, unalloyed, one multitudinous, nameless, yet a name, innumerably other, yet the same, immeasurable ecstasy where time and space have fainted in a swoon sublime. So, Sri Aurobindo tells us that one may not arrive all at once at this highest stage of using the power of the essential poetic imagination. There are successive steps through which the human mind arrives at this truest aim of poetry. So, uh, the beginning is with intellectual stuff. That is, we begin by intellectual poetry, and this has its own adequacy and effectiveness, and this kind of verse is sustained on and achieves its success by dealing and capturing in words mainly the external realities. So ideas which are obvious are the theme and substance of this kind of poetry, and so we cannot expect the quality of such poetry to be very high. Look at these lines of poetry from a modern poet. In a hut, a 6 month old child awakes and crawls across the dung washed floor, not asking where he goes. It is evening, there is light laughter, and the abundant darkness of water over which an uncertain light of the moon lies like a familiar but useless ornament. So we see the there is or there are images over here, but the imaginative quality here is not very high, and from the surface mind these lines seem to be composed. The second stage to which mind progresses gives us vital poetry, and this kind of poetry is strong, energetic, and appeals mostly to our sensations. In fact, the world's literature is full of this, and we can cite many examples, quote from innumerable poems. So I'm quoting just one or two lines where the poet says, "Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless stars of Ilium? Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss." Now, my God, reading these lines, so many pictures crowd the mind. Lines like these abound in Shakespeare's plays too. And I'm quoting some more from the English Elizabethans, lines of poetry which arouse sweet emotions in us, where one poet says, "Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove that valleys, groves, hills, and fields, woods, or steepy mountain eels." Now, the energy of the vital is there in these lines. The energy of the vital is contained in the address to the beloved to participate in the enjoyment of love. Okay. The next higher stage is where the poet can create poetry which is emotional, which stirs our feelings and senses and passions. And here the poet says, look at these lines, very beautiful lines, very romantic lines, where the poet says, "Sweetest love, I do not go for weariness of thee, nor in hope the world can show a fitter love for me. But since that I must die at last, it's best to use myself in jest, thus by faint deaths to die." Now, there is a difference in rhythm between this verse and the one I just quoted earlier. In this verse by John Donne, the English metaphysical poet, we have thought and contemplative attitude, and these are expressed along with the passion evoking words. So, uh, and then there is what we may define as intellectual poetry, which usually deals with the complexities of life or with the psychology of human beings. In fact, many Victorian poets specialized in delineating human character and psychology. But earlier, An earlier poet, Alexander Pope, also wrote poetry of the intellectual kind. For instance, take these lines from one of his poems, The Essay on Man, where he writes, "Heaven from all creatures hides the book of fate, all but the page prescribed their present state. From brutes what men, from men what spirits know, or who could suffer being here below." So, poetry of this type is clear reflection of the intellect of man, of intellectual thinking. There may be a little of philosophy here, but the poem is sustained mainly on its rhyming verse. Similarly, Browning is a good poet within his limitations, having created too many characters in and through his dramatic poems, which are interesting studies in human nature. Sri Aurobindo once wrote about Browning that there is much stuff of thought in him, and of course, a vast range of dramatic moods. But what is lacking in Browning as a poet is the pure light of poetry. Thus, he is a great creator, maybe, but not a great poet. Uh, anyway, whatever the type, however strong and powerful emotionally or intellectually, however appealing to the senses, these types of poetry satisfy only the surface soul in us. These afford pleasures for the mind only. According to Sri Aurobindo, in fact, the romantic poets fare better than poets like Pope and Dryden. These poets were perfect in their own way, though they had conciseness and precision, Sri Aurobindo says, but all within their limits. Now, elsewhere, Sri Aurobindo wrote that emotion of the external being is not good enough or sufficient for poetry. This outer surface material has to be transformed and transmuted into something deeper, something more permanent. Because the human mind always aspires for and seeks something more, something greater and higher, and whatever we think of ourselves, it is not our human nature to rest satisfied or stop at mediocrity. Thus, it is that we need poetry of the spiritual realization, which can allow us to share the vision and the rapture, as in these lines from Sri Aurobindo's poem, where he's writing, "A mystic happiness trembled in the breast, as if the invisible beloved had come, assuming the sudden loveliness of a face, and close glad hands could seize his fugitive feet, and the world change with the beauty of a smile." Wonderful lines from his epic Savitri. So, we may enjoy other types of poetry as we have just discussed. But for that poetic delight, we must go elsewhere, we must go higher. We need something more. And there has to be a fusion of what Sri Aurobindo says, the light and beauty of the beyond, and the less remote power and interpretative force of the intellectual thoughtlings. The vital, the emotional, or even the intellectual style of the poet and the corresponding thought substance cannot satisfy our deepest longings. We may have powerful expression in poetic language of the thoughts and emotions and ideas and sentiments, but that is not equal to or the same as that of the higher spiritual imagination. For instance, the poetical or even half poetical language of some poets may stir the vital or the mental in us. Let's look at a few lines. For instance, this is Byron writing, "I had a dream which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space. rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and brought no day. So, see, there are images here, but really no vision, as so um, it only half attains the status of high poetry. But this is not enough. Our soul seeks something more. So, for real poetic vision, we may go elsewhere. Look at these lines. With songs they send the mighty forth, sporting in wood above the fleece. Our Zams have glorified him of the triple height. Into the jars hath he been loosed, like an impetuous steed for war. And lifting up his voice, while filtered, glided on, gold hued and lovely in his course, through tangles of the wool he flows. This is the Rigvedic Rishi for us. Or take these lines from Sri Aurobindo's poem where he's writing, her face she lifts to him who is herself until the spirit leaps into the spirit's embrace. So, lines like these correspond to a higher style of poetry than the intellectual or vital or emotional. The highest poetic intensity is not even of the imaginative style. The imaginative style has great beauty of vision in it, with varying intensity of poetic speech. For instance, consider these lines where the poet is writing, I saw eternity the other night, like a great ring of pure and endless light, all calm as it was bright, and round beneath it time in hours, days, years, driven by the spheres like a vast shadow moved, in which the world and all her train were hurled. This is another metaphysical poet writing about his vision. So here is his vision certainly, but it's colored by the poetic imagination. Okay, let's look at some other lines which reveals perhaps a deeper vision. And this is by the mystic poet William Blake, where he's writing, I went to the garden of love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. Now, this evidently is highly symbolical because we know that the poet is telling us about something he never had seen with his physical eyes. So, for poetry, this kind of inner vision is very important. And in one of his letters, Sri Aurobindo wrote about the three essentials for poetry writing. One is, he says, the emotional sincerity and poetical feeling. Then there has to be a mastery over language and knowledge of technique of poetic and rhythmic expression. Then the power of inspiration. That is very important. That is the power of inspiration, or what we call the creative energy. That is one of the essentials for writing good poetry. So, the poets which we have been discussing, great poets, these have displayed to a great extent the revelatory power of poetic speech, yet the deeper vision is still missing in their words, language, and images. So they are a little short of capturing the highest intensity of the revelatory poetic word, as their vision gets covered by the external, the superficial, and the material. We may yet derive pleasure from this kind of poetry, even high pleasure, as for example when Yeats the poet says, in a tone of contemplation, too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. So when we read the poem, we see it's a poem called Easter 1916. So when we read it, we find There is a sudden drop in the poem from the philosophical to the physical level, uh, from where he draws his imagery. So, Yeats, Sri Aurobindo says, displays great poetical beauty, perfection, and power, even a creative imagination, but falls short of reaching and penetrating to the spiritual mental heights. So, we must perhaps remain satisfied with this sensuous delight, as this pleasure cannot pass into the pure spiritual anand. That is when we are reading poets like these. Now, that spiritual anand, that divine delight, that anand, that ecstasy of the creative revelation, that highest intensity is possible only when all elements of poetic creation are carried on the surge of a spiritual vision. And not only that, all elements are subordinated to this vision. The poet must use them to their highest capacity for poetic light and rapture. And Sri Aurobindo says that the highest poetic intensity follows no particular style and depends on no formula of diction. And this is something which cannot be fixed by rules and laws. It may come to us in any form, any time, anywhere. We see it reflected, for instance, in the decorative imaged style. This is abundantly found in some older poets. So, the image style and the images are all decorated by the vision of the poet. And the imaged, decorative image style, when at its highest. Listen to these lines and consider what images it evokes in our mind when the poet writes, when the young mango shoots for his sharp arrows, and with the row of bees forming his bowstring, the spring season arrives like a mighty warrior, O darling, in order to pierce the hearts of lusty men. Now that's Kalidas in his beautiful, beautiful composition, Ritu Sangharam. And everywhere in his works, we find the exuberance of this kind of imaginative beauty. And one can only marvel at the wide range of his imaginative faculty. Or this anand that we are talking about, this divine delight, this rapture may be born through the bare and direct expression where language becomes a vaulting boat for a leap into the infinite. These are Sri Aurobindo's words himself. So I'll quote a few lines from his poetry to exemplify what he means by this. He's writing, all was still in a silence of the gods. The prophet moment covered limitless space and cast into the heart of hurrying time a diamond light of the eternal peace, a crimson seed of God's felicity, a glance from the gaze fell of undying love. This is from his Savitri towards the end. So, this is poetic style itself, independent of other styles and formula. It is the word. It creates whatever it is constituted of rather than being created by them. And this is the style fit for the mantra. It is in this style alone that the spiritual vision may be expressed. The poet must leap to pure sight beyond intellect. This is, I think, it contains one of the essentials of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy of poetry. That is, from the mind, from the intellect to pure sight. And Sri Aurobindo had once commented that for poetry, one needed a special inspiration or genius. Without these, one can write good verse only, but cannot attain the heights of true poetry. So, um, What is poetry, and who is a poet, that is, who can be called a poet, and what is true poetry, genuine poetry. We shall look into this further in our next talks. So, thank you very much.